Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Grasshopper. Not only love, but chess is a battlefield. We are doing the 1000 best of the best golden games, the #1 game from each chapter. Each chapter has 10 games voted on by a panel of prestigious jury officials. In this particular case, we have Nikolai Grogius, who lives in Staten Island at the moment. I believe he's still with us. Laios Portish himself, the #1 winner from the previous Informant. Alexei Swayton, Taimanov, Onziker, Robert Wade, who wrote an excellent book on Bobby Fischer, considering this is one of Fischer's best efforts. Kozar Gligorich, one of Bobby Fischer's best friends, who did not vote this game as the #1 game. The only person to vote this game as #1, while it received #1 in accumulated votes, basically. As you can see across the top on that panel, the jury gave 10 points to their favorite game and 1 point to their least favorite game. And they had roughly 30 games to choose from, 30 candidate games to choose from, of which the top 10 would appear in the following Informant in a list, and only the best game would be published. Now, of course, Bobby Fischer being black against Bent Larsen, it is only a matter of course, by the way, that we will see the King's Indian defense. Now, today there are many ways to try to avoid the Grunfeld, so you might see F3s in this position, or maybe even the Trompovsky earlier, or the accelerated London, as we already know about. But in this particular case, after bishop g7, e4, d6, Bobby Fischer did go through a phase around this time period, perhaps a year earlier, where he did not play d6 at all, which led to a really amazing game between Letellier and Fischer, where Letellier took the overextended center in the 4 pawns attack and attempted to break down Bobby Fischer, but was mated in rather short order, so I hope to do that one as well at one moment or another. In this particular case, this jury is voting on the best game.
Kingslayer Sloan.
And while bishop e2
How are we
castles,
doing, John?
we are doing great, Rogan. How are you? Everyone
Kingslayer
is
Sloan.
going to get this in.
Said. Got a new mic I have.
Nice. And I haven't checked out your stream. I'll check out some of your videos on demand and see how it sounds. And obviously,
Kingslayer Sloan.
Said. Just been sound engineering.
Good. You might be able to help me with mine. Although I did set up some filters to make my voice seem a little less nasally than it is, or at least to make it sound like I want it to sound. That's a good question. Now, in this particular position on move number 6, you'll notice that on the 5th move, Larsen chose bishop e2, which leads itself to a variety of Averbach possibilities, as well as the classical variation, possibly the 4 pawns attack, with bishop e2 already included. Here, however, interestingly enough, Stockfish gives the nod to 2 very little known moves. h3, not unlike the Makhachanov variation, part of a restriction plan on black position, and the semi-Averbach, which is a plan chosen by one of my students as recommended by Grandmaster Irina Krush. And interestingly enough, this computer move lends itself to preventing knight to g4. As we're going to see in the game, knight to g4 is a definite, distinct possibility after the move knight f3, e5, castles. Now, of course, white could have played bishop e3, but it would be met by knight to g4. And in fact, if Bobby Fischer wanted to play the way he did in this particular game, after knight c6, bishop to e3, then it's possible that in this particular position he might have chosen an earlier e takes d4, knight takes d4, and rook to e8 to pinpoint this pawn on e4 as a weakness. The most popular move today is knight to g4, bishop to g5, f6, and trying to birdcage that bishop on the dark squares. The birdcage for the bishop is most notably found in the game Winter Capablanca, where white had a pair of doubled pawns and this bishop never saw the light of day. However, in our current game, Bobby Fischer actually chose the move rook to e8, pinpointing the pawn, and in my particular opinion, almost forcing white to decide whether or not they're going to close the center or fix the pawn on e5 as they do in the game with e takes d5. Now the benefit to e takes d5 is that we're following a rule of Steinitz's, that is, to fix a pawn in front of your opponent's fianchettoed bishop. So if you can fix a pawn in front of your opponent's fianchettoed bishop, this should likely lead to an advantage for white, as that bishop is out of the game. As we'll see in the game, though, this bishop turns out to be rugged support for a knight on the d4 square. And as I went through this game in analysis before, now in the Discord, we have a Golden Games assignment. I have 4 assignments of 4 games for the first 4 Chess Informant games. This is Chess Informant number 3. And Chess Informant has been around since around 1966, approximately. I don't know what the actual publishing date was, but I think it took place in the latter part of 1966, and it covers the 6-month period of each year. So this is the first half of 1967. The previous 2 games, the previous 2 Golden Games assignments were 1966, Portish versus Johansson in the Havana Olympiad, and game number 1 was Spassky versus Petrosian in the World Championship of 1966, the Moscow World Championship of 1966, which was a Tory attack, aka Queen Pawn game, which was requested in another stream when I mentioned that against the London, Tory, Beresov, Trompovsky, all those Queen Pawn games where white does not play the move c4, the Coley-Zukertort, black only needs one line to equalize, one line that they're comfortable with, and basically white has to prepare against all of those players who have their own distinctive one-line route to equality. And this is what lends us the experience to go back to the original Queen's Gambit with the ultimate versatility and dynamics that we can bowl our opponent over in a Titan versus Titan clash. However, if you're just trying to win your average club game, it's possible, and more than likely your opponent is not going to be prepared. So therefore, you can play the sidelines like the London, the Trompovsky, and the Tory. Now, knight to e8, knight to d8 is a typical response when you want to hold the e5 pawn. I have to admit, there was no actual danger to the e5 pawn. If white had captured the e5 pawn, the counterattack through to e5 would have allowed black to sacrifice, the sham sacrifice, knight takes e4, followed by knight takes e3, followed by knight takes e2 check if that were necessary, while this knight on e5 has no good desperados. So in any event, Larsen embarks on a very ambitious plan. He plays knight to b5, pinpointing the weak square c7, and the weak square c7, of course, lends itself to a further fork on the rook on a8 and the rook on e8. So we actually have to decide how we're going to handle that. And Fischer, of course, is well up to the task by playing knight to c6. Again, I have to mention that the move knight takes e5 fails miserably to the discovery with knight takes e4. Larsen, the fighter, is not really interested in grabbing material or allowing easy equalization. He wants to set problems for his opponent. So since the only thing defending this pawn on c7 is the knight on c6, the logical move is knight to g5. By playing knight to g5, we're going to remove the defender of the c7 square. So this means that black must tread very, very lightly. This is where we have to think carefully and appropriately. Candidates for black in this position. Remember, you want to throw at least 3 darts at the position in case your move is not amongst the
That was really good.
your chosen move is not amongst your top moves, but at least by that means you'll be able to have a couple of choices in the ballpark of where you need them to be. It's not unlike hitting the wall with a dart. You're allowed 3 darts. If one hits the wall, at least you have 2 in reserve to try to attempt something closer to the bullseye or to a scoring number that you'll be rewarded with. This again is brought to you by the power of Chess Informant, and the 1000 game Best of the Best link can be found here. I'm going to attempt to do this each weekend with a number of illustrative games and perhaps showing off other Chess Informant material that has been sent to me in the recent past, just to let you know what they're working on as a true laboratory of tools for players to better their game, to improve their game, to become chess professionals themselves. So in this particular position, there is only one move for black in this position, ironically, that will save that pawn, and it is rook to e7. Of course, at any moment when I hit the 45-second marker, you can, if you're watching the video on demand, pause the video and give yourself more time to write down moves. Circle one which you play, and of course, if the circled move is played, you can give yourself a win for each of the moves that we quiz on in this video. Now, this game is not necessarily a short one, but we will try to keep it to less than a minute per move on this video instruction, and we'll give it an appropriate amount of time as we fly through what I appreciated most from playing through all of Fischer's games when I was young: the coordination of pieces. So in this particular game, I have to give Larsen credit. He is the first person to reach the center with a rook, first person to occupy the open file, and the first person to create play. Now, this is an absolutely equal game. Nothing to be afraid of one way or the other in this position. And as it turns out, after the move b6, after all, the a7 pawn was being targeted as well as the c7 pawn, Larsen embarks on a plan with c5, a rather dubious one, to place his bishop on the c4 square. Fischer, of course, responds very boldly with knight takes c5, and this move did not look possible, as after the move rook to d8, check, bishop to f8, you can tell that this bishop needs to be guarded by the rook. Pawn on a7 needs to be guarded by the rook, so it makes that a free pawn. And you can tell also, you can note that Larsen held a great amount of respect for the bishop pair, given that he didn't capture on c5 to double black's pawns on the c-file, and he went out of his way with that knight, traveling from b1 to c3, b5 to a7, capture the bishop on c8, and to achieve a pesky rook on the 8th rank. However, this rook is about to experience some technical difficulty. Now, Fischer did not find perhaps the best move in this position, which was knight to b7, followed by knight to c6. Knight to d6. But instead, actually chose the prophylactic move king to g7, which is just as good in many ways, as we're going to release our bishop from the pit. And it's around now that white might consider possibilities of doubling black's pawns, but he'll give up the bishop pair, and instead chose to bolster his center with f3. Now, this leaves the knight no easy retreat, but Fischer takes care of first things first by attempting to evict the rook on c8 with the move knight to e8 and knight to d6. Of course, white in this position could Get a slightly better game with bishop takes c5 and double the rook, but chose instead to play the move a3. With the move a3 on the board, he's obviously planning on unseating black's outposted knight on the d5 square. So it is pretty obvious that Fischer needs to follow through on his plan of getting rid of the rook, picking the knight back so that he can actually evict the rook some more. And of course, not only is he attacking the rook, but he is preparing to place his knight on that very valuable d4 square, that outpost square that we were talking about earlier. So the rook moves to d8, b8, the rook on d8 moves to b8, and Fischer takes steps to just rid himself of that annoying and pesky rook altogether at the same time, clearing the diagonal for his bishop to reach c5. Bishop to b5 was a rather awkward move, and this falls in line with the concept that you don't want to move the same piece twice in the opening. We still have a rook on a1 to place. The rook to d1 would be perfectly acceptable, or we could improve our worst place piece. Since we don't necessarily have a destination for the rook to achieve anything, we could have played knight f2. So as it turns out, he chose bishop to b5, and the bishop is actually kicked back immediately with knight to d6. Larsen was prone to having these moments of tempo loss, it seems, as it plagued him even in their candidates match of 1971, which you will also see in our YouTube series on 1e4 or the Sicilian defense, when we cover the candidates match between Fischer and Bent Larsen a little bit more thoroughly. So in this particular case, the c5 square is calling. So knight to b7. And this would be a good opportunity if it weren't giving away free material for white to try to seize control of this particular square. However, it doesn't work out that well, because the square cannot be stopped from being occupied, since the pawn on b4 is not protected by anything with the pinned pawn on a3. Now this did not happen in the game, but white does have to find a way in with both his rook and his worst place pieces we mentioned before. All the candidate moves that he had before when he chose that lame bishop to b5 move are still in effect. We have the moves rook to d1, we have the moves knight to f2, and we might even have the move rook to c1. I believe before that bishop had to retreat to f1 to justify its existence off of the e2 square. Another candidate move previously was king to f1 to try to get the king into the game. But Bobby Fischer, if you want to occupy a square with a piece, by the way, if you want to occupy a square with a piece like a knight, it pays to try to remove the defender of that square. In this particular case, the bishop on e3. This forces the exchange of bishops, as bishop will be outposted on the d4 square, or the knight will be outposted on the d4 square if that bishop were to move away. And you can see how Fischer's coordination of his minor pieces and rooks is really, really paying off. Now, Larsen chose to move rook to d1, but without the bishop on the board, it might have made more sense to start by kicking away the knight and then centralizing the rook if needed. But we're tied down to that pawn on a3 after we play the move b4, so I don't blame Larsen at all for trying to find an active open line for a rook, whether or not that pays off now or in the near future. Fischer, of course, achieves the ideal pawn structure on the king side in rook and pawn endings. This is the ideal pawn structure, as this king will be able to monitor everything from the center while guarding at the same time the pawn on f7. and there will be fewer pawn weaknesses in the rook and pawn endgame as well. After the move rook to d5, king to f6, h4, finding the best move in this position for a clear advantage is not easy. In fact, I believe it would also have been beyond me. Therefore, while I give a shout out to that, we're going to ask for you to choose candidate moves for black in this position. Again, if you're watching this video on demand, you should pause the video, try to seek your own moves in comparison with that of what Fischer chose. For those of you who don't know me all that well, I am FIDE trainer and National Master John MacArthur. I don't think I've put that up in a few days. But I make a living trying to help players, not unlike yourselves, become better players. And I do it from 5 a.m. to 11 in the evening many times, depending on how late my students are. Summer is coming though. This is the last week of school. We will have even more instructional videos than you can imagine. I just need to create some thumbnails. I will probably create some thumbnails out of the book images that are already available. And speaking of thumbnails and YouTube editing, favorite YouTube editor and inspiration and joy to have in the chat, Logan Joe Sloan, has grown up, literally grown up, not only as a streamer, editor, but also as a player and a person while we've been in this situation getting out of COVID and becoming streamers ourselves. In any event, the three most likely moves in this position: attempting to kick the rook out, perfectly logical; relocating the rook to the d file, perfectly logical, so c6 or rook to a8. But Fischer actually chose the move king to e7, walking away from the pawn, which is absolutely taboo. If white wished to put more pressure on that pawn, they should try to do so with knight to d3. Larsen chose bishop to c4, but the danger involved in taking this pawn, that means that the rook could accidentally and easily be trapped by the move c6, and it's not going anywhere. So Larsen didn't take the bait. Instead, he improved his worst placed piece, the bishop on f1, attempting to get some counterplay on the knight on e6 perhaps, maybe even securing the b3 square against any knight invasions and locations to d4. And c6 is played to evict the rook. The rook returns to the second rank, and now Fischer achieves his ultimate goal of posting a knight on the 5th rank. Now, we mentioned it in an earlier stream that a knight on the 3rd rank is worth a knight. A knight that can be outposted on the 4th rank is worth a bishop, and a knight that is outposted on the 5th rank, on the 4th rank, is worth a bishop, and on the 5th rank, a knight is worth more than a bishop. And in an earlier game today, we actually got to see a knight outposted on the 6th rank, which was worth a rook. And here we are. Basically, white continues this theme of improving their worst placed pieces for this ending with king to f1. And while black tries to create some counterplay against the center by playing f5, white hits black's knight with b4. And the only reason why this is dubious is a very, very tricky consideration of black's alternatives. Candidate moves for black. He's in the best-selling town. Is there life on Mars?
It's on America's tortured brow that Mickey Mouse has grown up a cow. Now the workers they've struck for fame, 'cause Lennon's on sale again. See the mice and their million hogs, from Ibiza to the Norfolk Broads. Rule Britannia is out of bounds, to my mother, my dog and clowns. But the film is a sad and bore, 'cause I
And
wrote
now,
it 10 times or more.
considering that the best defense is a great offense, you might already consider that the knight might be well placed on the d7 square. However, Fischer, in his infinite wisdom and energetic play, chose a move that took the computer a very long time to find as the best move. So instead of the move knight to d7, which was its initial choice, Fischer fights back with b5. And the bishop has a little bit of a trick trying to find a safe square, because now those two knights are working together very, very handily. The bishop goes to the only possible square where it feels it can't be hassled by a rook capture on a3 should the bishop be on a2, or knights that are protecting most of those squares on the long diagonal, or pawns of the king. Now you'd think that he would play knight to d7 now, but instead, and it does take the computer a while to find this, he plays the move f takes e4. He plans on answering b takes c5 with the move e3. And that, of course, puts the rook in a little bit of a lurch. And that pawn on e3 doesn't go away. Sacking the exchange on d4, getting 2 pieces for a rook, allows black a very healthy pair of passed pawns. And you'd see those, you witness those passed pawns on these squares. So therefore, the recapture is necessary on e4. And at long last, Fischer finds himself retreating to the d7 square. Now he has many options. He can go to b6 followed by c4, or he could travel to the f6 square and put more pressure on the e4 pawn, which is what he had been doing before. Now the rook battens down the pawn weakness on a3 with rook to d3. And after rook a6, rook to c3 is a little bit of a less than best move. Now, personally, I don't think I would have found the silicon choice in this position. I would have more than likely played g3, not rook h3, which is the engine's first choice immediately off the bat. Even engines need a considerably greater amount of time to play good chess. And in the argument against rapid or blitz being equivalent to classical, perhaps only for entertainment purposes, but classical games give you plenty of time to think, and even the computer does not find the best move in the first 3 to 5 seconds. I mentioned to Lauren J.W. earlier, her opponents are getting no inaccuracies and no blunders, and they're playing nearly perfectly against her. But on the other hand, in this particular case, I would have more than likely gone for, after the move rook to a6, g3, at best. I don't know that I can improve my position, but at the same time, by placing the rook on c3, he's also attempting to improve his knight, giving himself d3 as a promising square. However, black gains time, or black should gain time, by tacking the rook on the f8 square and coming in and perhaps even bothering his opponent completely with rook to f8 and rook to c4. Or, after the move bishop a2, we also retain the option of attacking and then attacking some more. because of the pin on the bishop, which we mentioned earlier. That bishop being behind this pawn weakness on a3 does not make life any easier. So after rook to c3, Fischer chose c5, a very active counterattacking move with all the same purposes that we realized before. After all, the king is somewhat mated, and after the move b takes c5, it might be very awkward to meet the move a4. After all, the move b takes a4 is going to win material. Knight must block. And at the same time, we'll just go back and pick off these pawns as we see fit. So as it turns out, after the move c5, Larsen lashes out with g4 to attempt to create a pawn weakness on the h5 square. Fischer obtains a strategic advantage with a protected passed pawn. This pawn cannot be stopped by anything except for it being blockaded by a piece. After all, there are no pawns to stop that protected passed pawn from being a strategic point of strength. With that move, black is now winning. The bishop seems to be a spectator on g8. The rook is the worst blockader, but the knight still doesn't have any good squares to move to moving forward. So we only have our plan to complete. G takes h5 and g takes h5, and if this bishop can get to that pawn, that would be great. But I don't see a really logical way of getting that rook to that pawn. But he starts by centralizing his bishop and protecting the e4 pawn. Black tempos the bishop and the pawn on e4 with knight f6, and white seeks an opportunity to enter on the open file. Whether it's g5, g6, or d7 with check. Obviously, black has to act very urgently with knight takes d5, e takes d5, rook f6. And by playing rook f6, you can see that this king is already caught in the crosshair. So after king to g2, knight f5, already considering the possibility that knight to e3 means something, and the tagging on the pawn on h4. So at the moment, the rook is tied down to the defense of the pawn, and based on that prophylaxis that Stockfish had earlier, it might have been better to have that move in earlier than later. So the rook gets into the game with rook to g6 check, driving the king up. After all, we don't want the rook to come into the square and seek further exchanges, which might put that pawn in danger as well later. But after the move rook g6, king f3, knight to d4 check, king to d to e3, we finally get a rook to the 7th rank, and this is a very serious issue. Very serious issue. There we go. With the move rook a2 planned, all right, so how are we going to create more counterplay? Well, black needs to get his rook into the game. Sorry, white needs to get their rook into the game. He's planning on coming across, or perhaps parking himself on a timely e1 square later in the game, put this pawn under pressure. It doesn't work right away, obviously, because we have a knight fork on the squares. However, after the move king to d6, knight to e4 check, king takes d5, knight to c3, it appears as though black is making a tremendous amount of counterplay, a tremendous amount of headway. Where to move our black king, you might wonder. Well, we have a few choices. We choose king to e8 because he's going after the pawn weakness on h4. Larsen, however, chooses yet another creative plan to go after this pawn on c4 by, among other things, undermining it with the move a4. Rook a3 check, king d2. Oh, I thought he had to keep that pawn at night guarded, but he doesn't have to. And as it turns out, we tempo the rook. Once the king tempos back, remember counterattack is the best defense. Fischer seeks simplification in this pawn ending because of his protected passed pawn. Now, of course, white gets to play. He takes a4 and that passed pawn must be addressed. And after knight to e2, you can already see that a plan for pawn promotion is being set in motion. Well, again, we need counterplay. b5, c3, d6, and believe it or not, knight to c5 check after c2. King to d5. It's getting better all the time. Alright, so we do need to be within the square of the pawn. That much is true. We can't allow this pawn to queen. And after the move king to g2, king takes b6. We have a simple pawn promotion exercise in progress happening shortly. As we don't have any recourse against the move, b1 equals queen. Now this is one of Fischer's earliest encounters and his last charge in the 4 years before he takes on the throne in 1972. I believe he took most of the year of 1968 off, 1968, 1969. And they played his last U.S. championship. He was arguing for a longer U.S. chess championship because of the risks involved. But in a shorter round tournament, if you lose one game, you might not win the tournament. Basically, Bobby Fischer won the U.S. championship in every 8 tries that he played it from the age of 13 onward. He won the U.S. championship in 8 tries. I think he won it 4 times in a row, had 1 year off, and then won it 4 times in a row again, which is more than almost any other player. We are going to send you to Alexander Chess, who will be with me in Paris. Did I spell it correctly? And if you don't have the book, 1000 Best of the Best, you may find it here. You can find all the other Chess Informant products or read about their history with that article. And of course, the latest 155 is out. And we do have them in the top left-hand corner as we are parading them as best we can. And it looks like Alexander's organized an arena, which please follow Kingslayer Sloan. And we have a few celebrities in the midst. We have Chess Kudo, who ruined my day the other day as I thought I was going to finish in the top 3 in one of my own arenas. Actually, I ruined my day because I was doing very well against him until I wasn't. Chess Kudo from the Netherlands.
I'll be home in a minute.
Now, it's interesting that Alexandra Chess is not at her desk. However, we might be able to find some chess elsewhere. Let's go to my other favorite streamer. Please stick around for the raid. Thank you so much for sticking around. I appreciate all of your assistance in this. We're trying to keep these streams as short as humanly possible. Note that when the pawn promotes, we will use the remainder of the pawns to promote, even though we're only going to be a knight up in that final position. Thank you everyone for being here. Cheers and ciao. No risk. And by the way, this is founding dojo member Linda Diaz singing this song. She is a musical artist. You can find her on Spotify and all of your music playing services. Linda Diaz, ready for you, honesty, etc. Cheers and ciao, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon. I will probably do game number 4, if not today, soon. Cheers and ciao.